They thought the old barn was empty, until K9 Zeus refused to leave. His bark led Paul to 4 missing children, trapped in darkness and fear. One dog's loyalty, a man's courage, and a town's heart combined to rewrite their fate. This isn't just a rescue. It's a story of trust, healing, and hope. If you're an animal lover, hit subscribe for more stories like this. It's completely free, and it inspires us to keep telling the ones that truly matter. The sun had just begun its slow climb over Pine Hollow, casting golden streaks across the dew-soaked fields. Paul Simmons gripped the steering wheel of the patrol cruiser, his jaw tight, heart ticking like a drum. Today wasn't a typical call. Reports had come in overnight, 4 children missing from a neighboring farm. The barn they had last been seen near had been searched by deputies, volunteers, even drones, and yet it was declared empty. All clear, the first responders had reported. But Paul didn't trust it. Not one bit. Beside him, Zeus's ears twitched. The German shepherd had been with him for years now, through rescues, through traumas he'd never admit haunted him. But today Zeus was more alert than Paul had ever seen. Nose to the dashboard, tail stiff, eyes scanning the horizon as if reading signals invisible to the human eye. Paul glanced down. "You think we're missing something, buddy?" he asked softly. Zeus tilted his head, a subtle nudge of insistence, the kind Paul had learned to understand over countless calls and long nights. They reached the barn at the edge of the valley. Rusted metal panels creaked in the early wind, paint flaking like tired skin. Windows were boarded, doors locked, and the scent of hay hung thick in the air. Paul stepped out, boots sinking slightly in the morning frost, Zeus at his side. He opened the rear hatch, producing the familiar bundle of leashes, water, and a few essentials for the dog. "Go ahead," he murmured, voice low, steady. Zeus's paws crunched the gravel as he approached the barn, head low, tail stiff but wagging ever so slightly, a signal of both focus and readiness. The deputies had scoured every inch, but there was one corner Paul hadn't trusted, the south hay loft. Access required a narrow ladder, and the space above was thick with dust and cobwebs. The first time he'd stepped near it, he'd felt a chill, not from the morning air, but from something in the silence, something that didn't belong. He crouched near the ladder, glancing at Zeus. The dog barked once, short and urgent. Paul knew that bark. It wasn't playful. It was alert, commanding. His pulse quickened. Zeus moved first, nose to the barn floor, sniffing, circling, tail high. Paul followed, careful not to startle him. The smell was faint but distinct, a mix of sweat, fear, and something else, something unmistakably human. He took a step closer, then froze. A soft whimper. Paul's heart thumped violently. "Good boy," he whispered, kneeling, voice tight. Zeus barked again, then darted toward the back corner, digging at the loose boards of a haystack. Paul's hand went to his radio. "Control, we may have a situation. K9 alert active at the south loft." Minutes stretched like hours. The first small cry came from under the hay. Paul's mind spun, images of terrified children trapped, of every rescue he had ever performed flashing in rapid succession. He climbed carefully, removing the boards as Zeus pawed and nudged. The second whimper joined the first. Paul's hands trembled despite years of training. It's okay, we're here," he murmured, voice cracking. The first child, a small girl with wide, frightened eyes, emerged, pressing herself into Zeus's chest. The dog didn't flinch. He leaned into her, tail wagging, ears alert, an anchor of calm in the chaos. The other 3 followed quickly, 2 boys and another girl, all pale, scared, but alive. Paul guided them out of the loft, wrapping them in coats and blankets. Each child clutched Zeus as if he were a lifeline, a tether to a world where fear didn't control them. One boy, shivering violently, muttered, I thought no one would find us." Paul swallowed hard, kneeling to meet his gaze. "We're here now," he said firmly, eyes wet. "You're safe. All of you." Deputies arrived moments later, ushering the children to warmth, hot drinks, and medical checks. Paul stayed near Zeus, letting the dog receive the quiet praise he deserved. No one noticed the small gesture, the way Zeus rested his head on Paul's knee, eyes still scanning, still protective. That's what made him extraordinary. Not just his ability to sniff out danger, but the way he understood children, trauma, and fear the way no human could. By mid-morning, the children were safe, and Paul finally allowed himself a breath. The barn, once feared and empty, now held echoes of life and relief. Paul ran a hand down Zeus's back. "You did it, partner. You saved them." The dog wagged slowly, tongue lolling, but eyes never left the barn entrance, as if expecting another cry, another whisper of danger. Paul laughed softly through the tension. "You're not just a hero, Zeus. You're everything." And somewhere in that quiet, still barn, the smell of hay and sunlight, a bond that had always existed, deepened. For lives saved, one dog's intuition vindicated, and a man reminded that sometimes the smallest bark could pierce the loudest silence. The children huddled together in the warmth of the patrol cruiser, blankets pulled tight, faces still pale but showing the first flickers of relief. Paul drove slowly back toward Pine Hollow, glancing at each one through the rearview mirror. The youngest, a boy no older than 7, kept his small hand on Zeus's fur, squeezing gently as if he could will the dog to absorb all the fear. Zeus remained calm, head resting lightly on the boy's shoulder, ears twitching at every sound, eyes vigilant. He had no idea these kids were technically strangers, but instinct told him they were his responsibility. Paul cleared his throat, keeping his voice soft. "We're going to take it easy on the way home. No questions, no rush. Just breathe." The children nodded quietly, some still staring out the windows at the fields, the barns, the stretch of highway that had once felt endless and terrifying. Each mile was a reminder that they had escaped what could have been a permanent nightmare, and that they were not alone anymore. The fear of the unknown began to recede, replaced by the slow, steady rhythm of safety and trust. By the time they arrived at Paul's house, the sun had fully risen, casting a golden light over the yard. Zeus leapt from the cruiser with precision and purpose, tail high, surveying the new territory with practiced thoroughness. Paul followed, carrying the youngest child in his arms. The kids were amazed by the house, not because it was large or fancy, but because it felt alive. Windows opened to the morning air, the smell of coffee and bacon drifting from the kitchen. Paul set the boy down gently. "Zeus will show you the ropes," he said. The children followed the dog instinctively, as if they already knew him, already trusted him, even though they'd just met. Inside, Paul led them to the living room, where blankets, pillows, and a small table with coloring supplies had been prepared. It wasn't much, but it was enough to offer security, structure, and a sense of normalcy. One of the girls, trembling slightly, reached for the crayons, and Zeus lowered his head to watch her carefully. "Good," Paul murmured. "Take your time. No one's rushing you." The children began drawing cautiously at first, but the atmosphere shifted. Laughter erupted quietly when Zeus tried to bat a colored pencil with his nose, sending it rolling across the floor. The tension eased, small smiles forming, the first real signs of the day's trauma starting to unravel. Lunch came, simple sandwiches and apples, eaten with Zeus always nearby, ensuring no one strayed too far from comfort. Paul kept conversation minimal, only guiding gently, letting the children set the pace. No questions about what had happened in the barn, no probing for details. Trust had to be rebuilt, slowly, piece by piece. Yet in the quiet moments, he saw sparks of hope. Fingers tracing dog fur, small murmurs of shared jokes, even a tentative "thank you" or two. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. After lunch, Paul decided to take them outside. The backyard, wide and fenced, offered space to move, to breathe, to stretch the limbs that had been cramped with fear for too long. Zeus led the way, sprinting across the grass, circling the children, returning each time to make sure they followed. They ran after him tentatively at first, then with growing confidence, their laughter rising like music. Paul watched, heart swelling, knowing these moments were the first threads of healing being woven into the fabric of their lives. By mid-afternoon, Paul set up a small game. Fetch with a tennis ball, simple yet effective. One by one, the children threw the ball, their aim unsteady but improving with each attempt. Zeus chased, retrieved, and returned it with such eagerness that it was impossible not to join in the joy. Even the shyest child began laughing freely, the sound light, unguarded, and new. Paul felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes, but he swallowed them. There was work to do, plans to make, trust to solidify. As the day waned, Paul gathered the children and Zeus, guiding them inside for a quiet rest. Blankets, pillows, soft music, and the comforting presence of the dog created a cocoon of safety. One of the girls rested her head against Zeus's side, eyelids heavy, sighing in relief. Paul sat nearby, letting the silence speak louder than words. In that moment, he understood something he had always known but rarely admitted. Sometimes, heroism didn't roar. Sometimes, it lay in the quiet presence of a dog who refused to leave, a man who refused to abandon, and children who finally learned to breathe again. And though the barn had seemed empty, it had been full all along, with fear, with hope deferred, with the potential for rescue. Zeus had unearthed not just 4 children, but a chance at new beginnings, a thread of life reclaimed from darkness. Paul knew the work ahead would be long, delicate, and full of uncertainty. But he also knew that with Zeus at his side, and with patience and care, the healing could begin, and maybe, just maybe, Pine Hollow would never forget the day the barn spoke again. That evening, Paul made a simple dinner, spaghetti and garlic bread, and called the children to the table. The clatter of utensils and the warm smell of sauce filled the kitchen. For the first time all day, the kids didn't hesitate. They gathered around, plates in hand, Zeus sitting attentively beside the youngest, who fed him small bites under Paul's watchful eye. The dog's calm presence had begun to anchor them, offering silent reassurance that it was safe to eat, to laugh, to simply exist. After dinner, Paul suggested they do a quiet activity before bed. He brought out a stack of coloring books, a puzzle, and some blank paper. One boy picked up a pencil nervously, hesitating as he glanced at Paul. "You don't have to," Paul said gently. "But if you want to, I'll be right here." Slowly, the child began to draw, Zeus resting his head near the page as if supervising the work. The picture was simple, a house, a tree, a dog, but Paul recognized it immediately. This was the child's first attempt at imagining a safe space. As the evening wore on, Paul set up sleeping arrangements. The kids were too wary to sleep together, so he arranged blankets on the living room floor, near the fireplace, with Zeus lying between them. "He's a good guard," Paul whispered. "He'll make sure no one sneaks up on you." The children nodded, eyes wide, the weight of the day's trauma slowly giving way to the comfort of routine and protection. Later, Paul sat on the couch with a notebook, jotting down notes for the caseworker. He documented each child's reactions, their level of interaction with Zeus, the subtle signs of trust being formed. He knew every detail mattered. Every observation could make the difference between progress and setback. The tiniest change, a hand touching a dog's ear, a whisper of laughter, a hesitant smile, was significant. It was proof that trauma could be softened with care, patience, and a presence that didn't demand words. Night fell, and the house settled into silence. Paul peeked into the living room. Zeus was lying flat on his side, ears flicking at every sound, while the children slept with heads resting lightly on blankets or on the dog's fur. Paul allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection. He thought of the barn, the darkness, the fear he'd seen in the children's eyes. And then he thought of the way Zeus had worked tirelessly, digging, sniffing, reassuring, protecting. Sometimes, he realized, heroes didn't wear badges. Sometimes, they had fur and 4 legs and eyes that spoke volumes. The next morning, Paul woke early. He brewed coffee, scrambled eggs, and toast. The children were slow to rise, still groggy from the adrenaline and sleep deprivation, but when they entered the kitchen, their faces were calmer. Paul offered them first pick of plates and helped each serve themselves. Zeus sat nearby, tail wagging slightly, eyes trained on the children, always attentive. Paul had arranged a day of small, structured activities, board games, drawing, and a walk around the neighborhood park. He wanted to give the children a sense of normalcy, a taste of ordinary life that trauma had so violently disrupted. On the walk, Zeus led the way, sniffing every tree and fence post, occasionally nudging a child forward if they lagged behind. The kids began to relax, chatting quietly among themselves, noticing birds, collecting fallen leaves, and even daring to laugh. It was soft, hesitant, and beautiful, a sound that had been missing from their lives for too long. By mid-afternoon, Paul set up a simple game of fetch with Zeus in the yard. The children took turns throwing the ball, and with every toss, their confidence grew. Zeus returned each ball with a wag of his tail, nudging children gently to encourage another turn. One girl's laughter rang out, ringing bright like a bell, and Paul felt a lump form in his throat. The fear in her eyes had not vanished, but it was no longer all-consuming. She was beginning to understand that she could play, that she could trust, that she could exist without constant terror. Later, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Paul led the children back inside. He had prepared blankets and soft lighting for the evening, creating a calm, safe environment. Zeus settled in with them, allowing a small sense of security to envelop the room. One boy leaned over to stroke Zeus's fur, whispering something Paul couldn't quite hear, but the dog responded with a gentle nuzzle. The trust was reciprocal. The children were learning to rely on Zeus, and Zeus, ever vigilant, was learning that these children were part of his pack now. As night settled over Pine Hollow, Paul allowed himself a quiet moment on the porch. The stars shone over the town, calm and steady. He thought about how the barn, once a place of darkness and fear, had revealed not only the children but the potential for healing, resilience, and new beginnings. He thought about Zeus, the dog who had become the bridge between despair and hope, and he knew that this was just the beginning of a long journey, one of recovery, trust, and perhaps even joy. The barn had not been empty. It had been waiting for the right people, the right dog, and the right moment to bring light into four lives that had known too much darkness. And in that quiet, starlit moment, Paul understood something deep and unshakable. The work of healing wasn't just about saving a life. It was about restoring hope, teaching courage, and showing that even the most fragile hearts could learn to beat strongly again. The following morning, Paul woke to the smell of toast and brewing coffee. Zeus lay stretched at the foot of the couch, ears twitching at every small sound. The children were stirring slowly, yawns and stretches breaking the quiet. Breakfast was calm but purposeful. Paul made sure each child had a plate, encouraged them to eat, and sat quietly with them. The clatter of cutlery was less chaotic than the previous morning, a subtle but meaningful sign of progress. After breakfast, Paul decided it was time for another structured activity. He loaded the children into his truck, Zeus climbing in beside them as if he belonged there. They drove to the outskirts of Pine Hollow, to a meadow bordered by tall pines, where Paul used to train Zeus. The sun was high, casting golden light on the dewy grass. Paul unclipped Zeus's leash and handed a frisbee to the children. "Your turn," he said. Hesitation flickered on their faces, but Zeus nudged the first child gently, prompting a throw. The frisbee sailed awkwardly, but Zeus caught it, tail wagging furiously, and returned it to the child. A small cheer erupted. For the next hour, the children and Zeus played together, each throw building a little more confidence. One boy started to laugh, a bright, spontaneous sound that echoed across the field. The others followed suit, encouraged by the first. Paul watched from the edge of the meadow, heart swelling. The barn, the darkness, the terror, they were behind them now, replaced by motion, laughter, and sunlight. Each child's smile was a quiet victory. After playtime, Paul led them to a shaded area with a picnic blanket. He unpacked snacks, water, and a few drawing supplies. The children sat cross-legged, sketching the meadow, Zeus, and each other. One child drew a tall man with a strong arm and a large dog by his side. Paul recognized himself in Zeus, and a warmth spread through him. These images were not just pictures. They were proof that the children were beginning to feel safe enough to imagine a future. By mid-afternoon, Paul suggested a quiet time inside. The children read books or drew quietly, and Zeus lay in the center of the room like a furry anchor. One of the girls, who had barely spoken, picked up a small notebook and started writing. Paul peeked over her shoulder and saw short sentences. "Zeus is brave. I am safe. I like this place. He smiled, feeling a lump form in his throat. Words she wrote were proof of healing happening quietly, invisibly, yet powerfully. That evening, dinner was simple: baked chicken, mashed potatoes, and green beans. The children ate heartily, conversation tentative but present. Afterward, Paul introduced a game of charades. Zeus lay nearby, eyes following each movement, occasionally barking softly as if participating. The children began to laugh freely, gestures and guesses breaking the last remnants of tension. Even the quietest child had a smile, tentative at first, then growing more confident with each round. As night fell, Paul prepared the children for bed. Blankets were laid, pillows fluffed, and Zeus curled up at the edge of the room. Paul read a story aloud, his voice steady, soothing, the words creating a cocoon of security. One child leaned against Zeus, another nestled close to the blankets, the third held a stuffed animal tight. Paul watched silently, feeling gratitude for the simple things: a calm dinner, a game, a story, the steady heartbeat of a dog who had become more than a companion. He was a guide, a protector, a friend. Later, Paul stepped onto the porch. The wind carried the scent of pine and evening dew. He thought about the barn again, the darkness and the fear. What had begun in that place had transformed into something entirely different: hope, trust, and the beginnings of joy. Zeus barked softly inside, a sound that had come to symbolize safety and connection. Paul took a deep breath. He understood now that the rescue wasn't just about finding the children. It was about rebuilding their world, one small victory at a time. The next morning, Paul called in a favor with the caseworker. He wanted to begin the paperwork to make the children's placement official. "I want them to stay," he said. "All four. Long term. They're safe here." The caseworker hesitated only briefly, then agreed to start the process. Paul hung up and turned to the children. "This means you get to stay as long as you want," he explained. Eyes widened, the gravity of permanence settling in. For the first time, the children considered a future, one where they belonged somewhere, with someone who wouldn't abandon them. Over the following days, the routine took shape. Mornings began with breakfast, Zeus quietly supervising. Daytime was filled with structured activities: walks, games, crafts, and learning exercises. Afternoons offered quiet reflection, reading, or simply sitting with Zeus. Evenings were family time, stories, games, and soft music. Slowly, the children's hesitance melted. Laughter became more frequent, words were spoken more confidently, and fear was replaced by curiosity, by trust, by joy. One afternoon, Paul watched as the children played outside with Zeus, tossing a ball, chasing each other, laughter spilling into the yard. He realized how far they'd come from the terror of the barn. Each child had begun to reclaim their life, one small step at a time. And at the center of it all was Zeus, loyal and tireless, guiding them gently into safety and trust. Paul knew the journey wasn't over. He also knew they were ready to face it together, as a family, healed slowly by patience, love, and the steady presence of a dog who had refused to leave when it mattered most. By the following week, the children's routine had begun to solidify. Paul had transformed the spare room into a combined study and play space, complete with books, games, and soft mats for quiet time. Zeus was always present, a constant anchor in the room, gently nudging a hesitant child toward a small victory, a word spoken, a drawing completed, a laugh shared. The children began to interact more, initially in whispers, then in playful conversations, learning to navigate trust with each other as well as with Paul and Zeus. Paul knew the significance of consistency. Every morning, breakfast was calm, structured, and predictable. Each child chose a small task, whether it was setting the table, feeding Zeus, or tidying their area. Slowly, they internalized a sense of responsibility, which, in turn, reinforced their sense of safety. In these moments, Paul reflected on the fragility of trust and how quickly it could be built with patience and care. Zeus seemed to understand instinctively, positioning himself wherever tension appeared, ears perked, body low, radiating calm. One sunny afternoon, Paul suggested they return to the therapy farm. The children hesitated briefly but soon agreed, eager to see Lily the horse again and the other animals. When they arrived, the gentle clop of hooves and the soft nuzzle of goats and chickens brought a quiet serenity. One of the boys cautiously approached a goat, mimicking the gentle hand gestures Paul had demonstrated. The goat responded with trust, a soft bleat, and a nuzzle. Encouraged, the other children followed suit. Paul watched silently as hesitation gave way to confidence. Zeus remained at the edge of the pen, scanning and alert. The children's laughter rang out as they groomed Lily and brushed the goats. One child whispered softly to the horse, "I'm safe here." Paul's chest tightened at the words, realizing the profound weight of them. They weren't just interacting with animals. They were reclaiming their voices, reclaiming choice, reclaiming safety. Zeus barked softly, almost as if affirming their progress. That evening, Paul prepared a simple dinner. The children set the table with care, laughter returning naturally. Conversation flowed, tentative but present, questions asked and answered, small stories shared. The fear of the barn was no longer the defining feature of their lives. Instead, meals became a space of connection, of rebuilding, of shared experiences. Afterward, they played a quiet board game. The competitive edge was minimal, the joy of shared presence maximal. Zeus lay nearby, ears flicking, occasionally nudging a hand or head toward a child, reinforcing the sense of belonging. Later that week, Paul received a call from the judge overseeing the children's case. The adoption process could move forward and the children could officially become part of Paul's home. He took a deep breath and called the children together. "The court says you can stay here permanently," he explained. Eyes widened, smiles tentatively forming, disbelief mingling with hope. A hush fell over the room as they processed the news. Finally, one of the children whispered, "Really?" Paul nodded, his own voice catching with emotion. "Really? You're home." Zeus barked once, tail wagging furiously, as if understanding the significance of the moment. The children laughed, a sound untainted by fear. Paul sat back, taking in the scene. The warmth, the laughter, the security, the presence of a dog who had refused to leave even when darkness seemed absolute. He realized then that heroism wasn't always about bravery in the moment of danger. Sometimes it was about the quiet, consistent presence, the refusal to abandon, the patience to stay. The weekend arrived, and Paul decided to celebrate their newfound permanence. They drove into town for a small outing, first stopping at the diner where the staff had grown fond of the children. Tracy greeted them warmly, kneeling to speak to each child, praising Zeus as a hero. The children smiled shyly but were more at ease than ever before. They ordered milkshakes and fries, sharing laughter and stories of their week. Paul watched silently, gratitude overwhelming him. On the way home, the children dozed in the back seat, Zeus lying calmly between them. Paul glanced in the rearview mirror, seeing 4 lives, once fractured, now slowly knitting together through trust, patience, and love. At home, Paul tucked them in, Zeus curling at their feet. One child whispered, "Thank you, Paul." Another added softly, "Thank you, Zeus." Paul's chest tightened again. These simple words carried the weight of survival, of healing, of hope restored. Night fell over Pine Hollow, the quiet punctuated only by the occasional bark or rustle of wind through pine needles. Paul stood at the porch, looking toward the stars, thinking of the barn, the darkness, and the 4 children now safe and whole. He realized that the rescue had not ended in that barn. It had begun anew in their home, in small victories, in laughter, in shared meals, in quiet understanding. Zeus barked once inside, a signal, a reminder that even in silence, heroism was present, steadfast, and enduring. The following morning, Paul woke before the children, letting the soft light of Pine Hollow filter through the kitchen windows. Zeus padded silently beside him as he brewed coffee, a quiet companion in the stillness. Breakfast was cheerful yet calm, a gentle rhythm they had built over weeks now. Each child had their favorite plate and cup, and small chatter filled the room. Paul listened, savoring the mundane beauty of normalcy, a normalcy that had once seemed impossible. Later, he took the children to the community center, now fully functional thanks to volunteers and donations. The Bark Foundation's new space was warm and inviting, filled with books, art supplies, and soft seating. A bronze statue of Zeus, one paw raised, greeted them at the entrance. Paul saw the children pause, fingers brushing the cool metal, eyes reflecting a sense of reverence. For the ones who hear us, even when we're too scared to speak, Paul read aloud, and a small smile appeared on each child's face. They understood. Activities were simple that day: drawing, reading, interacting with the therapy animals stationed around the center. Mason, now a quiet leader among them, guided the younger kids in feeding the chickens and petting the goats. Laughter floated freely, no longer constrained by fear. Paul observed Zeus lying in the center, vigilant yet relaxed, his presence a constant reassurance. The children had learned something profound: that kindness, patience, and consistency could build trust where trauma had once reigned. After lunch, Paul organized a short walk around the property. The children held hands with one another, with Paul, or held Zeus's leash. They paused often, pointing out birds, bugs, and the colors of autumn leaves. Conversations were tentative at first, then flowed more freely. Mason shared a story from school about a reading challenge he had completed. The other children listened, eyes wide, absorbing the mundane triumph as though it were a miracle. Paul's heart swelled with quiet pride. That evening, Paul called for a family meeting in the living room. "We've come a long way," he began, seating himself on the floor with the children around him, Zeus lying at their feet. The barn wasn't the end. It was the beginning. "You've all shown courage, patience, and trust. Zeus showed you the way, and you followed." He glanced at each child, seeing their faces soften, the tension of fear replaced by acceptance. "From now on, you're officially part of this family. You belong here." The children's reactions were subtle but meaningful. Mason leaned forward, placing a hand on Zeus's head. Another child hugged Paul's side. Small nods, gentle smiles, and quiet words, "Thank you, I feel safe," filled the room. The room's energy shifted. It wasn't a declaration of legal guardianship that mattered most, but the unspoken understanding that they had been chosen, seen, and loved. Paul's eyes blurred as he took it all in, realizing that sometimes heroism is measured not in accolades, but in the unshakable act of staying, guiding, and nurturing. As the night deepened, Paul tucked each child into bed. Zeus moved from room to room, settling beside each one, a living guardian of their dreams. Mason whispered in the dark, "Good night, buddy," as he stroked Zeus's fur. Paul smiled in the doorway, seeing the transformation, a home once filled with fear now brimming with safety, laughter, and hope. The barn, the dark days, the trauma, it all had meaning now, giving way to life restored, bonds forged, and trust rebuilt. Weeks turned into months, and the town of Pine Hollow embraced the change. The Bark Foundation became a hub of healing and community engagement. Other children who had experienced trauma were invited, guided gently by the staff, the therapy animals, and the lessons Paul and Zeus embodied. Mason and the others participated willingly, teaching newcomers how to approach the animals, how to care, how to trust. Paul saw firsthand how one act of bravery, a dog refusing to leave a barn, could ripple through lives, creating a legacy of hope. One crisp autumn morning, Paul drove the children and Zeus to the edge of the town for a small picnic. They spread blankets, shared sandwiches, and watched the sun rise over the fields. Mason leaned against Paul, drawing shapes in the dirt with a stick. The others played nearby, occasional laughter ringing in the quiet morning air. Zeus trotted ahead, tail high, sniffing the wind, every so often returning to nudge a child, ensuring their safety. Paul exhaled slowly, feeling a rare, profound peace settle in his chest. In the end, Paul realized that heroism wasn't about the dramatic rescue alone. It was in the patience, the consistency, the courage to remain present when it would be easier to leave. It was in the willingness to let a dog lead the way, to trust instinct, and to create space for healing. Zeus had been the bridge between fear and trust, trauma and recovery. And the children had taught Paul as much as he had taught them, that even the smallest acts of love and attentiveness could create profound change. As the sun set over Pine Hollow, Paul watched the children laugh, Zeus running alongside, ears flapping in the wind, and knew that the barn, once a place of darkness, had become the foundation of something extraordinary. Together, they had built not only a family but a community capable of hope, resilience, and unwavering care. And in that quiet triumph, Paul understood what it truly meant to be a hero. Sometimes all it takes is to stay, to love, and to listen.